Yeah, so today my message is on dinner with God. So far through Exodus, we've been looking at the tabernacle. We spent a couple of weeks looking at that and looking at how the tabernacle in so many ways speaks of Jesus. And so as we move on, I just thought it'd be quite good to look at some of the aspects of how God was feeding the people of Israel in the book of Exodus. And so the first instance is this issue that we've touched on in this passage, where God has heard the people of Israel grumbling. And he's made this comment, "At twilight you shall eat meat," and he provides quail for that. "And in the morning you will be filled with bread, and then you'll know that I am the Lord your God." And so he begins this process. And so we're going to be looking at four particular aspects here. We're going to be looking at the fact that there was a complaint, there was no meat or bread. We're also going to be looking at the complaint that there was no water. We're going to be looking at the issue of quail in the evening, because there is a misunderstanding here in a lot of commentaries that I've seen and in a lot of books, and we'll touch on that. We'll look at this whole issue of the manna, the bread in the morning, and we'll look at the issue of the supply of water, when God supplies water. So first of all, let's look at the manna. This was something we've all heard of, the manna that comes from God. And what do we know about it? Well, God said he was going to rain bread from heaven. And the people came out and they saw this stuff all over the ground, what looked like these white flakes all over the ground. What is it? Anybody know what manna means? Yeah, I know you know. That's correct. The word manna actually means, what is it? What is it? And so the people of Israel, as they came out and they saw this stuff on the ground, they're going, what is it? And that's what it came to be called, manna. Now notice that in the description here, it can either be baked, so you can put it in an oven and bake it, or you can boil it in water, but there's obviously different ways in which it can be prepared. And yet, it's not heat that causes it to melt away. Because it says when the sun came up, it melted away. But you put it in an oven and heat it, you can bake it. You can make a kind of bread from it. It's not the heat that is doing this. It's a supernatural event. It was the ultimate superfood. It had everything in it nutritionally to keep them alive and keep them going. It actually supplied everything for their need. And it sustained them for 40 years. What else do we know about it? Well, again in this passage, what we read was that there was something about it supernaturally, that there was a consistent quantity. You got some people who went out and they're just grabbing as much as they can and filling as many pots and baskets or whatever, and they get home and they get their measure. Like it's like a jug, which was used as a measure for 1 omer quantity. And they would get their jug and they'd measure it out. And even if they'd sort of like grabbed a lot, when they'd measured out 1 omer per person, there was nothing left in the basket or pot. How did that happen? And yet those who, you can imagine perhaps the young are going out and they're just grabbing as much as they can. The elderly, perhaps, they're not as fit and able to sort of go out gathering a lot. And so they gather what they can, and they gather a small amount. And even though they've gathered a small amount, when they go back and they start measuring it out with their jug, they've exactly got a quantity of 1 omer per person in the tent, and there's no lack. There's nobody going to go hungry here. And then, of course, we hit this day on the 6th day where they go out, and because 1 or 2 of them have thought, well, let's be careful with this. We might not see this tomorrow. A little bit of lack of faith. Let's let's save a bit for tomorrow. And then the following day, there's this dreadful stench coming from it. And they look in the pot, and it's all got worms crawling through it and so forth. And, it's really unpleasant. And so they get to the sixth day, and they go out and they gather, and they're using their omer to measure out, and they suddenly discover they've got twice as much as they've had all week. Panic. What are we going to do with this? We do not want half our tent filled with this dreadful stench and with these worms. And so they go running to Moses to say, effectively, help, we've got too much. And Moses said, I did tell you that there will not be any manna on the Sabbath. You are not to go out and gather on the Sabbath. The Sabbath is now a holy day. It says it, in terms of taste, tasted like wafers with honey. And then it says it's like coriander in one place, white coriander. In another place, it's like delum or amber. Delum is another word for the precious stone amber. And if you've ever seen amber, it's a clear, transparent gem which is a golden yellow colour. And it's actually fossilized sap. And if you've seen the Jurassic Park movie, the first one, they talk about a mosquito that gets trapped in the sap, and that then they find amber, which has got the mosquito trapped in it, which they've used to try and recover DNA for dinosaurs. Whether that's even possible or not, don't know. But that's amber. That's delum. So those two descriptions kind of seem to contradict each other, and I think actually the white coriander is a description of its size and hardness, and because it says it's like white coriander in one place, and then in another place it says it's like delum in appearance, or amber in appearance. So I think it looked like a little piece of amber, but in terms of size and hardness, was like coriander. And we've already touched on the fact that if it's kept over one day, it stinks and produces worms. Didn't stink on the Sabbath. But we're given a command to take an omer of this and to put it in a jar so that for generations to come, people could actually have a look at it. Generations. Hundreds of years. Keep one omer of it a day in your tent. It stinks and attracts worms. But the jar that was placed before the testimony in the tabernacle, they could go and look at it every day for hundreds of years and see it, and it still didn't stink. It still didn't have worms. It still didn't melt away. It remained perfect in that jar. It's interesting that so many stories that we see in the Bible, that we know happen first in the Bible, things appear later in other cultures. And something which is very similar to this in description appears in the Greek culture. It was called ambrosia. The word ambrosia actually means immortality. It was the food of the gods, food that comes from heaven. It's also described as being like a nectar. It was an aromatic liquid, and it's also been aligned with honey. Isn't that interesting? That we have, centuries beforehand, we have the manna from heaven, which has these attributes, the taste of honey. And then in Greek mythology, we have this idea of ambrosia, food from the gods, from heaven, that brings life. A people of Israel who have been sustained on it for 40 years. It's given them life for 40 years. In the Greek mythology, something very similar to it is described. Its actual name even means immortality. And you know it lasts right up until the very moment that they enter into Canaan. The moment they enter into Canaan, actually what it says is, the day they began to eat of the produce of Canaan was the day the manna stopped. The moment they ate of that food in Canaan, which again is food that God has prepared in advance. He talks about it as a land flowing with milk and honey. And that day, the moment they begin to eat in that land, it stops. By the way, it's interesting to note that God says that the promised land is a land flowing with milk and honey. That's a promise he makes to them. I'm going to take you to a land flowing with milk and honey. And if you look in Isaiah, there's a point where there is a massive famine in Isaiah. And I came across an interesting little verse one day that says, in the middle of this famine, and every man had one cow. He had milk. And then it says, and God caused a wind from the east, which brought bees into the land. So in the middle of that famine, the one thing they still had was milk and honey. God looking after his people by feeding them. And then we saw this first time that he brings the manna, the first time that the Israelites came and grumbled, we see this quail. And we see that it says that in the evening the quail came up and covered the camp, and in the morning the dew lay around the camp, and the dew produced the manna the following morning. And so what has been taught in a number of areas is that this was a provision that continued to happen. That throughout the time in the wilderness, every evening or every morning there was manna, and every evening there was quail. But actually, that's not true. That quail that appeared only happened that first time when the manna was first introduced. The people were hungry. We want something to eat. Feed us. So God said, okay, this evening you will have meat to eat. You'll have quail. But tomorrow morning I will start raining down bread from heaven, and you will live on the manna. Now we know that to be the case because when you get to Numbers, you'll see this. It says, now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving, and the people of Israel wept again and said, oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there's nothing at all but this manna to look at. They got fed up with it. What, the same thing again? This is perfect nutrition, tastes great, but they were bored with it. They wanted something different. They wanted a bit of a change in their diet, and they're grumbling, and God's actually quite miffed. And effectively, he says, they want meat, I'll give them meat. So he says, I'm going to send some quail. So this hasn't happened before. Okay, it's only happened on that first day that he's provided quail, but now there's this period of time has gone by. They got bored with eating this manna every day and start complaining. They keep on and on complaining, this people. And God says this, he says, you're not just going to eat it for one day, or 2, or 5, or 10, or 20, but for a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils, and it becomes loathsome for you. You want meat? I'll give you meat. And then it says, God loves bringing things in wind, doesn't he? A wind from the Lord sprang up, and it brought quail from the sea, and it let them fall beside the camp, about a day's journey on this side and a day's journey on the other side around the camp. So much quail, you could walk for a day before you get to the edge of the amount of quail that's fallen. But hang on a minute, you couldn't even walk because, what does it say? It says, and about 2 cubits above the ground. They can't move, they're locked in. They aren't going anywhere. They can't move for the amount of quail there is. And I came across this cartoon, which I just thought was lovely. I don't know why I bothered to continue to look through this recipe book. I'm never going to find a recipe with manna as the only ingredient. And the other guy is saying, as long as it doesn't include quail, I'm good. He's one of those who's reached that point where it's got to the point where it's coming out of his nose and he doesn't want to see another quail. He's not interested anymore. It's interesting that you don't actually see quail come up as a food. After this in the Bible, it was like a one-off thing here. Then we get to water. It says at one point they'd gone for 3 days without any water, and guess what? The people started grumbling again. They don't seem to just ask, do they? They don't just sort of, Moses, what's going to happen here? You know, we haven't had anything to drink for a while. Have you got a plan? Has God got a plan? But no, it's grumbling. Oh, we're going to die. God's going to kill us again. They haven't learnt from the other grumblings. They haven't learnt yet from God's provisions. And yet, here's this 3-day period where they haven't managed to have any water. And they've come across this place called Marah. Well, it wasn't called Marah until they got there. And when they tried to drink it, it was bitter. It was undrinkable. And so God spoke to Moses, and Moses told Moses to take a log and to throw it into the water, and the water became sweet, and the people were able to drink it. And they travel on, and they come to a place called Elim. They do come to a place called Elim, there you go. They come to a place called Elim, where it says there were 12 water springs. So these aren't just pools of water, these are springs, each one of them. There's 12 springs here. And there were 70 palm trees. It's like a little oasis with 12 springs and 70 palm trees. And you know, we've touched a lot on the sort of numbers we see in the Bible. Isn't it interesting that there are 12 sons of Jacob, and it tells us that when they went into Egypt, he had 12 sons, but there were 70 people who went into Egypt. There are 12 tribes, and there are 70 elders. There are 12 springs, and there are 70 trees. This link between the 12 and the 70 appears a number of times in the Bible. And so they keep on going, and then they come to a place called Rephidim. And again, they're grumbling. Oh, we're going to die. Familiar cry comes up again. We're going to die. There's no water. What are we going to do? And it says that God told Moses to go to a rock in a place called Horeb and to strike the rock. Although it doesn't use this term in this particular passage, it does mention it elsewhere, that the rock split. And in splitting, it then produced this water that flowed out from there. Isn't it interesting that Jesus is the rock? This is another type. Jesus is the rock. He was crucified, he was struck. And from him flows living water. It's another type of Christ in here. And so there's this idea where they've gone to this place where there is this thing that's called the Rock of Horeb. and that Moses has gone up to it and struck it, and it's split. And so we have this drawing here of a place where this rock has been split and the water flows out of it. And it was a lot of water. And that rock has been found. It is in a place called Horeb. And it is a rock that's sitting perched there which has been split. And if you look on the right-hand side, you can see at the bottom, can you see how the rock is worn away and made smooth as though an enormous quantity of water has flowed out of this and has smoothed the rock, has caused this flowing effect in there. You can see how it's almost carved out a curve on either side, and you've got this lighter colour which has all been smoothed out. And it's quite interesting that there is a whole documentary where in a fairly unexpected place, it's in the region of Saudi Arabia and actually follows a particular route. But in this area where this is, you can actually see the 12 pillars that were set up by Moses in this area. You can actually see the places of worship that were set up there. There's ancient Hebrew writing in the area. And so there's a lot of stuff which comes out of Exodus which is found in this fairly tight area. As an aside, we were watching a documentary last night, part of a series of really, really effective documentaries where a lot of research has gone in, and the guy is a believer who's making these documentaries, and he gets involved with archaeologists, and there's one archaeologist in particular that I've been following for many years. What actually lends credence to some of this stuff is that there's a guy called David Earle, who I caught a documentary on BBC decades ago when David Earle was a young man who had just started to notice there's something wrong with the Egyptian timeline. And he'd remapped the Egyptian timeline, but he was having real problems with Egyptologists of the day who didn't want to accept this revised timeline. And one day he's sitting in a hotel and he's thinking to himself, surely there has to be an ancient document that I can refer to that ties up with this timeline. And he happened to be looking for a pen and opened a drawer and found a Gideon's Bible. And at first he didn't think anything of it, and then it suddenly clicked, hang on a minute, that is an ancient document. I've got a feeling it says something about this period. And so he gets it out and he starts making notes and finds that the sequence of events describing Exodus fully matched his sequence of events in his revised timeline. The man is still not a Christian today, and yet he's provided such a huge amount of archaeological evidence to support the entire Exodus story. And one of the things that he was looking at in this documentary we were looking at last night, which I found particularly interesting, especially when you bear in mind the stuff we've been looking at about the Hebrew language and how it gives us all these insights into the prophetic nature of looking at what Jesus is going to do. It turns out that the ancient Hebrew text that I've been showing you, it turns out that ancient Hebrew text is the oldest recorded alphabet to have ever been found. And that even though there were other linguists who were disagreeing that it was Proto-Hebrew text, so they don't agree that it's that, and he's open enough in the documentary to actually interview these people, and you hear them. People like David Earle and a couple of others, there are more people supporting David Earle now. Again, many of them not Christians, which lends credence to our case, as it were, who are saying, no, they start showing you alternative views on this and showing how this ancient alphabet was the earliest known alphabet that appeared at the time of Moses on the Revised Timeline. And they describe it as a work of genius. The non-Christians are describing it as a work of genius. And yet what we can see, and I'll go into this more at some later date where I can show you that there is actual evidence that suggests that when God was building the universe, he was also actually creating the Hebrew language at the same time because of the way it lines up. Big subject, won't go into it now, but it's fascinating. If anything, it's a proof that God exists. But the last thing I'll just touch on here is that a lot of this we've seen as God providing food for his people. But there is an amazing day when 74 people from the people of Israel met Jesus. God said, come and have dinner with me. He says, come up to the Lord, you, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 7 of the elders of Israel, and worship from afar. Come to the Lord. It says that Moses and Aaron and Nadab and Abihu and 70 of the elders of Israel went up. Now God was quite clear, the people do not step foot on the mountain. But he has specifically invited this group to come up. Not all the way up, because the top is where God is, and that's the only person who's going to go up there is Moses. But part way up, these people have been invited up. And it says, next verse, they saw the God of Israel. And there was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. They saw a manifestation of God in human form. They didn't see all of him, but they saw him in human form. And they saw under his feet like a pavement of sapphire, clear, bright blue. And when God manifests himself in a human form, you can actually take it as read that this is a pre-incarnate Jesus. Looking straight on God is a dangerous affair. But here, he has come, he has presented himself, he's talking with Moses and the elders and Nahab and Abihu. And it says, and God did not lay his hand on the chief men of Israel. They beheld God, and they ate and they drank. They came and had dinner with God. And then after that, it says that God then invited Moses on up. Now, at this point in the story, Moses has already received the law weeks earlier. It says Moses wrote it down and came down the mountain and he read it out to the people. And he delivered the law to them, he spoke to them. But then God invited Moses to come on up the mountain again. And it's just after this, Moses went up and God gave it to Moses, the same law, although it's only the 10 Commandments, we believe, rather than all the rest of it, but gave Moses the 10 Commandments in stone form. You know, paper didn't exist then. Computers didn't exist. You couldn't keep it as a video file or anything of this sort. And, you know, the sorts of things they used to write on then didn't last long. In fact, the Egyptians used to have these wooden frames with wet clay in them. And they would open it up and they would write in the wet clay, and then they would bake that, and then that would be a record. And so important issues were kept like that in the palace. But Moses wrote down a lot in order to record all the law that God had given him. But now God's giving him the 10 Commandments. set in stone, something that will last, something that he can show to the people. Today, we're invited to have a meal with God regularly. It's the communion. We're in a place where we can actually step into the presence of God. We can, as you've seen from what we've been looking at in the tabernacle, we can enter this tabernacle, this heavenly tabernacle. We can enter into the very presence of God. And we eat the communion there. We eat the bread. We drink the wine as a meal that we have in the presence of God. All of these things we're seeing back here in Genesis and Exodus, these are all types and shadows of what's to come. And we do it so simply, we take it for granted that we can come together in worship before God. We talk about coming into his presence, and we share this bread and wine in communion with him. Amen.